Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. And in for Amy this morning is Chicago Tribune Page 2 columnist John Kass and podcaster. Get to check out his podcast, The Chicago Way. John, great to have you, as always.
Great to be here. What a great discussion on journalism.
We did, and now we need a great discussion on how we got here. I'm talking about the lockdown policies. Now, even as we're reopening, some states obviously much more aggressively than others. And I want to go back to this interview I did last night on my syndicated show with Dr. Scott Atlas, who's the former head of neuroradiology at Stanford, who just reminded us of some basic things that seem to have been lost in this discussion, like what the purpose of the lockdowns was in the first place.
That would be literally irrational and impossible since we have millions of people with a viral infection. Irrational because almost 99% of people that have the infection have either no symptoms at all or have a mild disease that doesn't require serious medical care. The other point that's counter to science, people who want to extend this, is that we know the fatality rate is far lower than what was originally used to necessitate the lockdown, maybe a tenth, but even worse than that, of their ignoring the data, is that the fatality rate is extremely low. In fact, if you look at the data without just summarizing a bottom line, actually look at it like a critical thinker, those who are under 60 have a fatality rate, infection fatality rate, that is less than or equal to seasonal flu. It is just factually incorrect to think otherwise. And that's data from France, Spain, the Netherlands, and all over. The other point that people have failed to do, that the policymakers have failed to understand, partly because they have no medical perspective on things and partly because they are simply afraid themselves because they're just human beings, sort of not sophisticated in terms of looking at illness, is that the risk to children is extremely low. In fact, virtually zero for deaths from the data, and nearly zero for a serious disease. I mean, we know this from all of the numbers on hospitalizations.
And so that was an argument against extending the lockdown. But what about the argument against the lockdown, the way it was perpetrated in the first place? Where did this come from? I've referenced this piece over the last couple of days, both on my syndicated show and on our morning program here. And I just can't reference it enough. It is just astounding. I cannot believe that this is actually how we got to this policy choice that has gripped the entire world. And this Jeffrey Tucker research and historical account should be read by everyone who's interested at all in living in a free society. I don't know how else to describe it. The 2006 origins of the lockdown idea. And I'll let Jeffrey Tucker tell the story because he's the one who brought it to us. Jeffrey Tucker, editorial director for the American Institute for Economic Research and author of The Market Loves You, Why You Should Love It Back. Jeffrey, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
So the lockdown and social distancing policies, the genesis of them.
Big topic. You know, I hadn't heard that term, social distancing, until I watched that movie Contagion in 2011, made in 2011. I saw it just as the lockdowns were beginning, and I thought, this is strange. It seems like we're almost trying to play out that movie in real time. You know, it seems like a foreshadowing fictional version of reality we're going through right now, including the whole theory that the way to deal with the virus is to run and hide, walk around in a spacesuit, stay away from each other, stay away from people. And it really bugged me watching this thing because I thought, that's a completely different theory from that which my mother's generation, my mother and Paul's generation had. They were coming out of World War II. They had a very sophisticated view of natural immunities and exposures and the idea of stopping society or wrecking anything or banning gatherings or anything like that, much less staying away from friends, not letting your kids go on play dates or blah, blah, blah. That would have been inconceivable to those people because they had a very sophisticated understanding of viruses. So anyway, I was trying to figure out what happened. Where was the lost knowledge? How is it possible that my mother understood very well viruses when I was growing up, but somehow we've got a whole generation that doesn't understand anything at all? this idea that you can run and hide, the virus goes away. But so I began to look into it. It turns out, basically with the turn of the millennium, we had a new generation of intellectuals that took over virus policy. They were not medics. They were not experienced epidemiologists. In fact, they were opposed passionately by the most experienced epidemiologists and people who actually understood viruses, like, for example, Douglas Henderson, who eradicated smallpox, wrote passionately against these people. They were computer scientists. The main one in the U.S., now, the UK has its own issues and things. In the U.S. case, his name was Robert Glass, and he worked for San Diego Laboratories in Albuquerque, Mexico, and he was hunkered over his daughter. She was 14, was working on a high school science fair project, mapping the way the human contact among her peers. And, just kind of built in a couple of assumptions there. If they had a virus, how the other one would get the virus and the other one would get the virus. But if you kept them apart, then the virus wouldn't spread. And he had this eureka moment and knocked out this paper based purely on computerized modeling and physics. I mean, that's his background. He has absolutely no medical background whatsoever. Banged out this paper calling for social distancing policies, that when the virus comes along, we should all just hunker down, stay in our home, cancel schools, large events, close malls, and so on and so on. No consideration whatsoever given to economics, human rights, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, or even the reality of how viruses themselves behave, which is that they don't go away because you hide them. Basically, his theory of viruses is the boogeyman theory, Run away from it. Anyway, that paper was so riveting and exciting. George Bush brought together a team of doctors and computer scientists and had them argue about what should be the policy of the future. He was very concerned about bioterrorism, that sort of thing. Well, the modelers and the geeks, basically the same people who created Pac-Man and so on, prevailed over the doctors because they had a more impressive presentation before the political class. And many aspects of the Glass policies got written into the CDC policy in 2007. And you can read that document online and see that it's a kind of a moderate version of lockdown that very quickly became an extreme version. As I say, all the epidemiologists were against it and wrote passionately against it and said, this is a pre-modern view. This is more akin to the policies they used in 1918. And we learned that is not the right way to control the virus. But they didn't prevail. That's the story.
And the epidemiologists you refer to, and doctors, Dr. D.A. Henderson and colleagues from Johns Hopkins, in 2006, the mitigation measure of the lockdown, as a mitigation measure, they write, should be eliminated from serious consideration. Should be eliminated from serious consideration, and yet 14 years later, here we are. And not only is it seriously considered, it's been the policy for the last 2 months.
So that paper by Henderson and colleagues is prophetic. It says that through these methods of social distancing and closures and lockdowns, especially school closures, they're completely against them, or banning of mass events or shutting down anything. He said you can turn a manageable pandemic into a catastrophe. That was his word. And another thing about that paper, he said, if you do this, you will discredit public health officials and government forever.
Prophetic, I think, is a good descriptor.
So we can blame Bush now
Well,
for listening to a 14-year-old girl. Is that what you're telling us?
I think Bush was in an apocalyptic mode at the time, and was, he had just been through 9/11, invaded Iraq. He was I think was not in a good position really. And it was the politicians that didn't look. I talked to somebody who was at those meetings, and this person described it as a bunch of Kennedy School bureaucrats and political hacks and State Department bureaucrats and these kind of people who didn't understand the first thing about disease mitigation or viruses or anything else. making policy decisions over medicine and therapy that they had no clue about, and they went for the PowerPoint, the fancy three-dimensional PowerPoints, over the advice of doctors. This person said that the doctor's presentation was kind of boring. It was like, well, when a virus comes along, you have to wait and see who the vulnerable populations are. Hope they don't get it. Promote natural immunities into the rest of the population. Mitigate things as much as possible. Don't disrupt anything. Wait for the case fatality rates to come in. Test as much as possible. Boring things like that, right?
Sure.
And
instead
the bureaucrats are like, we're looking for something a little more Iraq invasion-like here. You got anything?
Shock and awe. Yeah.
We need some shock and awe.
Yeah, it's like we need to invite Greta Thunberg in here. It was the precursor to Greta Thunberg participating in a pandemic town hall. Let's sex this up a little bit. So what you just described what they recommended. The Johns Hopkins people, D.A. Henderson, who, as you mentioned, was the international lead on the smallpox vaccine.
Damn right.
And so what they're essentially saying is what a lot of people said at the outset: we should phase in and then phase out. Imagine that symmetry.
Yeah, the lockdowns in this is fascinating because the lockdowns in this country were promoted under the claim that we had to preserve hospital capacity since there's going to be mass deaths. We're going to have millions and millions of people die. So our hospitals will be overwhelmed. So we have to flatten the curve, which just means prolonged pain. And that turned out not to be true. But then, so here's the problem when you develop bad policy on bad theory. You don't know how to dig yourself out of it,
Exactly.
And that's what we've got going on right now. Like everybody presumes that this mandatory closures, forced business, and that if you get next to somebody that you run a risk of the COVID boogeyman is going to appear. Once you start believing all this nonsense, which is just medieval and mystical and insane, once you start believing it, it's hard to roll back, as you can tell. Like I loved your introduction to the show, by the way. If everybody could hear what you just said, they would begin to decompress and think rationally and clearly and intelligently about this virus. But unfortunately, I think probably about a third of the country is rational and intelligent, calm about this. But the other two, and then a third is that they're glued to CNN every second, and the 24-hour news cycle, and they can't think their way around it. And then a third is just confused and lost and doesn't know what to do. That's where we are as a country right now. And yeah, I blame bad theory and lockdown policies and the CDC and the hysterical media and the fact that we put a bunch of computer scientists, politicians in charge of disease mitigation, where we should have left it to the medical professionals, as we did in 1969, as we did in 1967 to 58, as we did in 1941 to 52, and so on.
It's interesting you say about they don't know the way to get out. They don't know how to get out because they've staked their reputations, the politicians, on this, and they can't figure a way out because a way out, from talking to actual medical professionals, there'll be more cases, but it's not about more cases. It's about preventing hospitalizations and deaths. So protecting the vulnerable, which should have been the approach at the outset, as Dr. Atlas and so many others, Dr. Bhattacharya at Stanford as well, have argued from the beginning. And that's exactly what Johan Gesicki, the former head of the former state epidemiologist for Sweden, said from the beginning. Come to me a year from now and we'll see whose approach was the better approach. And just with respect to the CDC, so, all of the things we didn't know that they didn't want to admit that they didn't know. And so let's just err on the side of martial law, effectively. CDC, the study yesterday, the novel virus does not spread easily via contaminated surfaces, does not spread easily from touching surfaces or objects, after we spent much of the last 8 weeks talking about not only washing your hands, but, having hazmat teams come in and clean your house and office every single day.
Oh, it's great. For anybody under the age of 56, with healthy people under 56, this is scarcely a disease at all. And we know this now. We've actually known this for a very long time. In fact, there's no excuse for anything we did. Do you recall the very first of COVID-19 in this country that made the news? Remember what it was? It was the Seattle nursing home.
Yeah, Washington State, right. Yeah, right.
Yeah, if we had any brains out of civilization at all, we would have looked at that situation and said, maybe this is a vulnerable population. Maybe we should focus our mitigation efforts on this demographic. Viruses all are different. 1968 targeted pregnant women. Can you imagine? 1957, a lot of children died. 116,000 Americans with a population of only 200 million at the time. Polio, 49 to 52, maimed young girls between the age of 5 and 9. I mean, give me a break. These were wicked diseases. This one, we know it targets people with very low life expectancy. We know this. We've known this for months now. But yet, I thought truly, in early April, I started throwing out the demographic data. I thought, well, now that we know this, everybody's going to calm down and we're all go back to normal. Nope, didn't happen.
Yeah, you know why? Because we have people like Melinda Gates who have a disproportionate voice in the debate in this country and in the Western world saying COVID-19 anywhere is COVID-19 everywhere. And, you know, these other refrigerator magnet bromides from what are supposed to be serious people. It's just it's so infuriating. And I got to tell you, this piece that you did, providing the historical context of how we got to this place, is so important and so well done. I really appreciate your work on it and joining us to share it.
So some other time, call me back and I'll tell you how people at the Gates Foundation have responded to this piece.
Oh, give us the top line. Is the top line not positively?
Well, they're very anxious to not be blamed for the lockdowns, so they think that I was a little bit loose and claiming that the 2007 document is responsible for that. So I still have to write about this because I think that's not correct. But it's very, very important to the Gates Foundation that they not be blamed for what happened. They don't want to take the blame for it. And by the way, I can predict it's not just Gates Foundation, but in a year from now, you will not find a single politician in this country.
Nobody supported the lockdown. Nobody voted for Nixon.
Right? That's right. Nobody voted for Nixon. A year from now, they're all going to say, I was never for this crazy policy. I was against it all along.
Jeffrey Tucker versus the fear porn artists would be my headline.
There you go. Jeffrey Tucker, editorial director for the American Institute for Economic Research, author of The Market Loves You, Why You Should Love It Back. Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Take care. And he joined us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.
The stories you need to know to start your day. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
This is Albert Mohler for townhall.com. Our government spending is way up, and everyone's seemingly fine with it. A recent headline at the New York Times captured it well. A giant deficit, once dreaded, is now desired. Historically, of course, we've had a long-standing argument in American politics about debt, the deficit, and government spending. But now, all those old rules seem to be completely out the door. On both sides of the political aisle, we have politicians making arguments they wouldn't have believed they could have gotten away with just 8 weeks ago. Republicans don't